He is risen. Yeah, happy Easter. Best day of the year. This is so good to be together. Welcome to the Canopy parking lot. You know, this morning I was reminded of a story after the people of Israel returned from exile. Some of them came back and they rebuilt the temple and the walls, and there was this moment where some of them were so excited about the new temple that they were jumping up and down and singing and laughing, and some of them were weeping because they remembered what the old temple was like and it wasn't the same. And we had a similar morning. For those of you who are out here, if you're new to Canopy, you're probably thinking this is incredible. I'm so excited to be outside for Easter. How cool. Who's excited to be outside for Easter? Yeah. That's because you weren't with us during COVID in this parking lot. If you were part of Canopy during COVID, you've had some PTSD setting up this morning. And maybe you're twitching a little bit. It's going to be okay, I promise. It's going to be good. Welcome. It's good to be together. If you have been with us over the past couple of, Sunday, Good Friday, or today, you'll know that we're doing something a little different during this Holy Week. Rather than having these kind of sermons, traditional sermons, what we're doing is we're telling stories. Now, don't get me wrong. I love sermons. It's going to be great. We'll have more, I promise. But we, on Palm Sunday a week ago, we did a story about this guy named Simon the Zealot. And then on Good Friday, we talked about Barabbas. And today, I'm going to tell the third story that I wrote as part of the series. It's out of Luke chapter 24. Before I tell the story, I'm just going to read the passage, and then we're going to go from there, okay? So this is after the resurrection account that Mike just read. Here's what happens in Luke 24:36. While they were still talking about this, Jesus... No, wrong one. Hold on. Put my marker in the wrong place. I was like, that's not where I want to be. Okay. Here we go. Now that same day, this is the day Jesus rose from the dead, two of them were going to a village called Emmaus, about 7 miles from Jerusalem. They were talking to each other about everything that had happened. As they talked and discussed these things with each other, Jesus himself came up and walked along with them, but they were kept from recognizing him. He said to them, "What are you discussing together as you walk along?" They stood still, their faces downcast, and one of them, named Cleopas, asked, "Are you the only one visiting Jerusalem who doesn't know the things that happened in these days?" "What things?" he asked. "About Jesus of Nazareth," they replied. "He was a prophet, powerful in word and deed before God and all the people. The chief priests and our rulers handed him over to be sentenced to death, and they crucified him. But we had hoped..." Hold on. See, this is it. This is what happened in the parking lot every time, okay? I'm just having all these memories. But we had hoped that he was going to be the one to redeem Israel. And what's more, it's the third day since all this took place. In addition, some of our women amazed us, and they went to the tomb early this morning, but they didn't find his body. They came and told us that they'd seen a vision of angels who said he was alive. Then some of our companions went to the tomb and found it just as the women had said, but they didn't see Jesus. He said to them, "How foolish you are, and how slow to believe all the prophets have spoken. Did not Messiah have to suffer these things and then enter his glory?" What's going on, man? How are we doing? Happy Easter. Yeah. "And beginning with Moses and all the prophets, he explained to them what was said in the scriptures concerning himself. As they approached the village to which they were going, Jesus continued on as if he were going further, but they urged him strongly, 'Stay with us, for it's nearly evening and the day is almost over.' So he went in to stay with them. When he was at the table with them, he took bread and gave thanks and broke it and began to give it to them. Then their eyes were opened and they recognized him, and he disappeared from their sight. They asked each other, 'Were not our hearts burning within us while he talked with us on the road and opened scripture to us?' They got up and returned at once to Jerusalem. There they found the 11 and those with them assembled together and said, 'It's true, the Lord has risen and has appeared to Simon.' Then the two told what had happened on the way and how Jesus was recognized by them when he broke the bread." So that's our story. That's our context. I've kind of made up a fictional frame around this using some contextual information. I have decided that the two people on the road are Cleopas, who also had another name in the text. His name is Alphaeus. So you may remember James, the son of Alphaeus, is one of the disciples of Jesus. So I think that this Cleopas is Alphaeus, James's father, and the other disciple on the road with him, I believe, is his wife, Mary. because she wasn't named in the story, and the only reason I can think that only one of them was named was that you usually named the husband in a pair. So I think it's Cleopas and his wife going for a walk. And with that conjecture in place, allow me to read the story. Can't put the Bible on the ground. That's just wrong. Okay. Of all the walks he'd taken with his wife over the years, this was officially Cleopas' least favorite. You see, they were having a discussion. Married people, you know what I'm talking about. Cleopas had never seen his wife so frustrated, so hurt, and the worst part was, he was the cause. Well, at least part of it. But there was nothing to be done for it. They had to get out of Jerusalem right now for so many reasons. It wasn't safe, there was nothing there for them any longer, and they had responsibilities at home. But Cleopas couldn't bring himself to admit that the real reason was he simply couldn't stand to be there any longer. Every street, every stone reminded him of what they had hoped and what they had lost. They had to get out of town, yet Mary was determined to stay. She had to understand, had to see what happened next. So round and round they went, their discussion growing in passion, but waning in insight. Normally they didn't argue all that often, but it had been a strange week, an emotional week, really an emotional year. You see, Jesus had burst into their lives like a hurricane after years of drought. Their son James was the first to meet him and quickly signed on to join the cause. Initially, both Cleopas and Mary were skeptical of Jesus and more than a little irritated that he barged so suddenly and unapologetically into their manageable lives. Sure, they'd heard stories about him, and all the stories were remarkable, probably too remarkable. But they had their doubts. After all, what kind of a rabbi, let alone prophet, would ever recruit their son James? He was a good boy, but not at all the sharpest tool in the shed. His parents realized very early on that he was never going to be a scholar. So they bribed and threatened him through elementary school, just so he wouldn't be an embarrassment to their family or themselves. And then, after he made bar mitzvah, pulled him from school to help run the family business. And this seemed to work fine for everyone involved. James took to the work rather well, and his parents got consistent and, most importantly, free work. And now along comes this upstart rabbi, himself a religious school dropout, the son of a stonemason, from Galilee of all places. And he recruits their boy to follow him. James was, of course, flattered and joined immediately, but his parents were annoyed. Who was going to pick up his slack around the business? They certainly couldn't afford to pay someone. So Jesus didn't make a good first impression, and from there things just got worse. James, in an effort to win over his parents, invited them to attend a dinner party that someone in town was hosting for Jesus. So being supportive parents, they hesitantly agreed. However, before they arrived, as they were walking up the street toward the house, they regretted this decision. This wasn't the kind of party that respectable folks such as themselves should be seen attending. The street outside and presumably the house inside were filled with the wrong sorts of people doing the wrong sorts of things. They felt like they just stumbled into a frat party, or at least that's how they would have felt if frat parties had been invented yet. They turned to go, but before they could make their escape, James spotted them. "Mom, Dad, come in. I want you to meet Jesus." And before they could protest, he grabbed them by the arm and rushed them through the door. As James dragged them across the room, they recognized quite a few faces, not from their circle of friends, mind you, but from the other side of the tracks. And the conversations they heard as they made their way to Jesus made Mary's ears burn. What kind of a holy man would ever associate with these kinds of people? James pointed Jesus out across the crowded room. There he is! His back was to them. He was a lot shorter than they expected him to be. Cleopas thought a person would almost need to climb a tree to see him through the crowds. If you know, you know. They'd already made up their mind that this Jesus was not the kind of person they wanted in their lives, and they fully intended to communicate this to their son in no uncertain terms as soon as they got home. But then something happened. Jesus turned around and looked right at them. Cleopas stopped in his tracks. Mary audibly gasped, and James just stood there with a dumb smile on his face. It was his eyes. The moment his eyes met theirs, it was like nothing else happened, like time and space ceased to exist. Like there was nowhere but here, no one else but he and them. Those eyes, they sparkled and burned at the same time, as if you were on the verge of both laughing and weeping. But at the same time, he was serene. There was no madness in his eyes, but perfect clarity, as if he was completely aware of everything that was swirling around him, seeing every person, every possibility all at once. Yet they felt as if he were seeing only them, as if nothing else mattered to him. This would be a topic of debate in their family for years to come. Mary swore he was looking right at her. Cleopas insisted that Jesus didn't even know Mary existed. But James absolutely knew that he was Jesus' favorite. Regardless, the point was, from that moment on, everything changed because all they wanted was to be wherever he was. Over time, they learned more and more about the man behind the eyes. They learned that, yes, he was a rabbi who taught with more courage and more authority than they had ever heard. But he was so much more than that. He was also a miracle worker, a prophet cut from the cloth of Moses and Elijah, with what seemed to be a direct line to the Almighty. In fact, many were convinced, Cleopas and family included, that he was the Messiah, the promised one who would redeem Israel once and for all. So when he announced his intention to journey to Jerusalem, the air crackled with energy. He was going to claim his throne, and they would all go with him, his disciples, his army, his parade. Of course, Cleopas, ever the realist, expressed half-hearted protests about who would run the family business in their absence. But Mary just gave him that look. And that's how they ended up in Jerusalem, and that's where things got weird. Everything started out okay. Better than okay, in fact. It was fantastic. Upon arriving in the outskirts of Jerusalem, Jesus had found a donkey to ride into the city, and everyone knew what was going on. Rejoice greatly, daughter Zion. Shout, daughter Jerusalem. See, your king comes to you, righteous and victorious, lowly and riding on a donkey, on a colt, on the foal of a donkey. I will take away the chariots from Ephraim and the war horses from Jerusalem, and the battle bow will be broken. He will proclaim peace to the nations. His rule will extend from sea to sea and from the river to the ends of the earth. So as he rode that donkey down the Mount of Olives, across the Kidron Valley, and toward the Temple Mount, that's just what they did. They rejoiced. They shouted. They waved palm branches. They threw their robes on the ground, rolling out the proverbial red carpet. At one point, Cleopas, forgetting about his trick knee, even danced a little jig, and Mary laughed. As soon as they arrived at the base of the Temple Mount, however, it became clear that not everyone was excited about Jesus as they were. The opposition they'd expected to come from the Romans came instead from their own religious leaders. They seemed threatened by and afraid of Jesus. So rather than ramping up for a showdown with the Romans, Jesus spent the better part of the next week debating with members of the Sanhedrin, the Jewish council, each conversation more heated than the last. More disturbing was the fact that the pressure of it all seemed to be getting to Jesus. He didn't laugh as much. He used to laugh all the time. He had all sorts of serious conversations with his disciples, talking about suffering and death. And then on preparation night, the night of the Passover feast, was the strangest of all. He talked to one of his disciples about betraying him. He talked about how they were going to carry on in his absence. His absence. Where was he going? That night, while he was praying in the garden, they came for him. They arrested him, and all the disciples scattered, afraid they might be next. There was a sham of a trial, lies, half-truths, and rumors. And inexplicably, Jesus didn't say or do anything to clear his name. The one they had seen effortlessly win every debate he'd ever been in, and the one they'd witnessed performing mind-boggling miracles simply stood there and said nothing. They beat him and handed him over to the Romans to be crucified. Jesus and his disciples came into town on a Sunday, following their king, convinced that the world they had always wanted, had always dreamed was possible, was within their grasp. He died on Friday. This was not the way it was supposed to be. Everyone was confused and terrified. This was not at all why they had come to Jerusalem. This was not what they had signed up for. Not only were they not living in the anticipated glory of the New Jerusalem, now they were afraid for their lives, afraid that anyone might recognize their Galilean accents and associate them with Jesus. Many of those who'd made the journey to Jerusalem simply went home, trying to get out of town before they had to answer too many questions. A few stuck around, too paralyzed by grief even to think. They sat through the longest Sabbath of their lives, going through the motions of liturgy mindlessly, muscle memory, the only thing keeping them going. Sunday morning, the first day, a few women, including Mary, and against her husband's wishes, woke early determined to visit the tomb. He had died so abruptly on Friday afternoon that they hadn't had time to properly prepare his body. So despite the fact that he hadn't turned out to be the king they were hoping he would be, they'd still loved him and were determined to honor him. They prepared the spices and slipped quietly through the pre-dawn darkness to the tomb. What happened next would be a matter of some debate in the coming hours, days, millennia since. Here's what the women said had happened. As they walked to the tomb that morning, somber yet determined, Mary Magdalene had a troubling realization. How are we going to move the big rock? You see, a large stone had been rolled in front of the entrance of the tomb to keep anyone from tampering with the body. No one had any good answers, but they did the only thing they could do. They kept moving forward. They would figure it out when they got there. Imagine their shock then when they discovered that the problem had been solved for them. As they got close enough to the tomb to see, they found that the massive stone had been rolled aside. They stopped dead in their tracks, a million different thoughts running through their heads, not one of which they would discover was anywhere close to what actually happened. Was this the right tomb? Yes, they were all quite certain. Had someone tampered with his body? This was an extremely high-profile case. Maybe someone was up to something, though what they couldn't imagine. Maybe the Romans had done something terrible to make a point or incite a riot. Maybe the person who had done this was still there. Should they be worried about their safety? They felt all of this and more in the space of a second. Mostly, they felt afraid and curious. In the end, curiosity always wins. So they cautiously approached the tomb and peeked inside and then stepped in where they discovered that the grave clothes that had been wrapped around his body were folded neatly and placed on the bench. But there was no body. A few more minutes of silence, and then Joanna spoke, giving voice to the question that was on everyone's minds. Where's the body? Her whispered question unleashed a torrent of words from everyone present all at once, questions and theories and fears, mostly fears. Suddenly, the dim interior of the tomb exploded with a light that coalesced into two figures standing right next to them. And they thought they had been scared before. They had no idea what was happening, but they were certain they were about to die. So they did what any reasonable person would do in that situation. They fell on their faces, ready to beg for their lives. The two men, however, spoke up first. Get up. We're not going to hurt you. Their voices reassured, but their presence still terrified. So the women reluctantly obeyed, rising, but averting their eyes out of simple necessity. Why are you looking for Jesus in a tomb? Living people don't hang out in tombs. There was amusement in the men's voices, as if they were trying to explain the most obvious thing in the world. But the women were completely dumbfounded. He's not here. Their amusement turning to exasperation. He's risen. Don't you remember? He told you this was going to happen. At least 3 times, one of them whispered under his breath. At those words, it was as if the light that surrounded the men enveloped the women as well. More than enveloped them, it filled them. It went straight from their eyes to their souls, flooding every dark corner, chasing away all questions, all doubt, all ignorance, all fear. They remembered. They saw Jesus' face in their mind's eye. They heard his voice. The Son of Man must be handed over to sinners, must be crucified, and on the 3rd day will rise again. The weight of the memory and the understanding that accompanied it sucked all the air from their lungs and drove them to their knees again, gasping and weeping. After a few moments of this, they recovered their strength enough to ask a few follow-up questions. But when they raised their heads, they found that the 2 men had vanished as suddenly as they had appeared. They were once again alone in a dimly lit, low-ceilinged, and most importantly, empty tomb. They simply stood and stared at one another, slack-jawed for a moment, and then almost as one bolted for the door, back down the path to the house where the disciples had been staying. At least, that's what they said had happened. None of the disciples took them seriously, of course. After all, they were just women. Peter had the decency to go to investigate and found that the women had been telling the truth about the empty tomb, but none of them, Peter included, bought the story about the angels and a risen Jesus. And this was the reason for the discussion Mary and Cleopas were having on the road that day. You see, Cleopas, ever the realist, was ready to go home, back to the family business. He was devastated, terrified, and embarrassed. He had allowed himself to be swept up in the mass hysteria surrounding Jesus. He had let his emotions get the better of him. He, a pious, discerning man, had backed a false Messiah. Never again, he promised himself. He was going to get home as fast as he could, put the whole mess behind him, and never return to Jerusalem again. Yet, there was a small corner of his heart that dared to hope. And it was to this corner that Mary was appealing. After all, she'd been there. She'd been to the empty tomb. She'd seen the angels. And she finally understood what Jesus had been trying to tell them all along. And she was desperate to stay in Jerusalem, to see what might happen next, to see Jesus again. She knew he was alive, and still more than anything wanted to be wherever he was. Yet, there was a small part of her that doubted. And it was to this part that Cleopas was appealing. And this is where they found themselves on that Sunday afternoon, on the way out of Jerusalem, heading west toward Emmaus. That's what they were discussing when a stranger approached them heading in the same direction as they were. They were so engrossed in the conversation that neither of them noticed the man approaching until he greeted them. Startled, Cleopas stopped in his tracks, and Mary gasped audibly. "I'm sorry for startling you," he said, "but I was wondering if I could join you on your walk. It's been a long week, and I'd really enjoy the company." Normally, Cleopas would have been cautious and politely refused. One couldn't be too careful these days. But there was something about this man, a presence, a essence that immediately put them at ease. Besides, they'd had a long week too and were grateful for the company and the change of subject. The stranger settled in next to them, his hands tucked into the sleeves of his robe, his head down. They walked along in silence for the next few minutes, each simply taking comfort from the other's presence. Then after what could have been 5 minutes or could have been 2 hours, he broke the silence. "What were you talking about?" Seemed to be a pretty important discussion. He gave them both a knowing look, a slight smile on his face. With this, both of them came stumbling to a weary halt, unable to take another step. It was as if his words, innocent though they were, had knocked out the last peg, and the full weight of everything they experienced over the last week, over the last months, came crashing down on them. One simple question, and their souls were laid bare. Yet the stranger simply waited beside them, his hands still tucked into his sleeves, a patient smile on his face. For Cleopas, weariness boiled over into irritation. "Where have you been? Have you been living under a rock? Are you the only person in Jerusalem who doesn't know what happened here this week?" Unaffected by the little outburst, the stranger simply cocked his head slightly and said, "What do you mean?" Now, had they been in their right minds, they might have exercised a little more caution, not knowing the character or political affiliation of the stranger standing beside them, but they were far too weary for subterfuge. And beside, they both felt safe in his company, so the words tumbled out in a torrent, and they told him everything. They told him about their son James, about meeting Jesus, about his words, his power, his eyes. They told him about the journey to Jerusalem, all their hopes and expectations. They told him about the arrest, the trial. They'd beat him. How could they beat him? They mocked him and spit on him. They nailed him to a cross. "Don't you understand?" Mary wailed. "We thought he was going to be the one to redeem Israel, to save us all." For a moment, her doubt got the better of her. You know how grief is. Cleopas put his hand on his wife's shoulder and lovingly, without sarcasm or malice, recounted the story of the empty tomb. For a moment, hope got the better of him. You know how grief can be. And when their story was over, they were both exhausted and confused. And they stood there in the middle of the road, shoulders slumped, heads down, hearts on their sleeves. And for a moment, the stranger just stood with them, not saying a word, regarding them through shaded eyes, the hood of his cloak being over his head, arms crossed, hands tucked into his sleeves. And then he smiled, and his smile broke into a chuckle. And Mary and Cleopas looked at him with hurt and anger, but before they could berate him for his insensitivity to their pain, he spoke, a smile still on his face, amusement, and a hint of exasperation in his voice. "Knuckleheads. I'm surrounded by knuckleheads. How did you miss it? You know your Bibles. Don't you see? It had to be this way. The Messiah had to suffer. He had to die in order to fulfill his purpose." And then he just started walking again. They stood staring at his back, eyes wide, mouths open for a couple of seconds before they came to their senses and ran to catch up. "What do you mean? Did you say Messiah? He had to die? How can he be the Messiah if he died? Do you think he's alive?" The questions poured out in a flood, and the stranger let them exhaust themselves to silence before he answered. Do you remember Adam and Eve? What God said to them after they sinned and cursed the world? He said that a child would be born from the woman, whose heel the serpent would strike, but who would crush the serpent's head. A wounded victor. Don't you see? The blank looks on their faces showed him that they didn't see, so the stranger, with a patient sigh, continued. He told them about Noah, about the salvation of the righteous and the destruction of the wicked, and showed them how, with Jesus, it was the salvation of the wicked by the destruction of the righteous. He reminded them about Abraham and Isaac, Mount Moriah, or as they knew it, Golgotha, a father who placed the wood on his son's shoulders, a father who placed his son on the wood, a God who stayed the Father's hand, keeping him from sacrificing his only son. About a God who placed the wood on his son's shoulders. A God who placed his son on the wood. A God who did not stay his hand, but sacrificed his own son for all of us. Jehovah Jireh, God has provided. The God who told Abraham, "Now I know that you love me because you did not withhold your son, your only son whom you love, from me," invites us to the cross where we cry out, "Now I know that you love me because you did not withhold your son, your only son whom you love, from me." He led them through the story of Joseph, an innocent sufferer who, by suffering, rescued those who had caused suffering. He reminded them about the Exodus and the Passover lamb whose blood painted on the doorpost of the house turned aside the just wrath of God. And then he reminded them of the words of John the Baptist. "Look, the Lamb of God who takes away the sin of the world." What did they think that had meant? He told them about Moses, whose plea was that God destroy him in place of God's people. But that cry wasn't answered. Yet Jesus made the same plea and his cry was answered. He told them about the book of Leviticus and the Day of Atonement, where the high priest placed his hands on a pure and spotless goat, and in so doing symbolically passed the sins of the community onto the goat so it could be sacrificed and the community forgiven. He showed them how Jesus was both the high priest and the sacrifice, willingly placing upon himself the sins of the world and taking them to the cross. God made him who knew no sin to be sin for us, so that we might become the righteousness of God. He led them through the stories of the judges, stories of sin and desperation and rescue, where God's people sin and suffer the consequences of their sin and cry out to God for rescue and are rescued and then do it all over again. He showed them the ultimate futility of a judge who rescues through strength and conquest. The true problem was never the enemies without, but the enemy within. And only love expressed in humility, in sacrifice, can conquer that foe. He told them the story of Ruth and Boaz, the story of a man who paid a high price to rescue the one he loved and who loved him in return. And how this story was really the story of Jesus, who paid a high price, the ultimate price, to rescue the ones he loved, though they did not love him in return. He told them the story of Esther, the queen who was willing to sacrifice herself to save her nation, and how this story was really the story of Jesus, the king who did sacrifice himself not only for his nation, but for all nations, for all people. He told them of David, who by killing had established and secured the kingdom of Israel, and Jesus, the true heir to the throne of David, who by dying had established and secured the throne of the kingdom of God. He reminded them of Job, the pure and upright, whose suffering, though undeserved, put him in a position to intercede on behalf of his stupid friends. He took them to the Psalms. My God, why have you forsaken me? Why are you so far from saving me, so far from my cries of anguish? My God, I cry out to you by day, but you don't answer. By night, but I find no rest. I'm a worm and not a man. Scorned by everyone, despised by the people. All who see me mock me. They hurl insults at me, shaking their head and saying, he trusts in the Lord. Let the Lord rescue him. Let him deliver them since he delights in him. I am poured out like water. All my bones are out of joint. My heart has turned to wax. It's melted within me. My mouth is dried up like a potsherd. My tongue sticks to the roof of my mouth. You lay me in the dust of death. Dogs surround me. A pack of villains encircle me. They pierce my hands and my feet. All my bones are on display. People stare and gloat over me. They divide my clothes among them and cast lots for my garments. They had been there that day. Did any of this sound familiar? He took them to Isaiah. He was despised and rejected by mankind, a man of suffering, familiar with pain, like one from whom people hide their faces. He was despised. And we held him in low esteem. But surely he took upon our pain and bore our suffering. Yet we considered him punished by God, stricken by him and afflicted. But he was pierced for our transgressions. He was crushed for our iniquities. The punishment that brought us peace was on him, and by his wounds we're healed. We all like sheep have gone astray. Everyone has turned to his own way, but God has laid upon him the sin of us all. He took them to Hosea, the story of a man who sacrificially loved a faithless wife, and a God who sacrificially loves a faithless people. He took them to Jonah and told them the story of a man who was cast into a storm so that many outsiders could be brought into the family. A man who was swallowed by death so many could be saved. And of course, this is where the story turned, isn't it? He reminded them that Jonah didn't stay in the belly of the whale, but came out alive after 3 days. Isaiah's suffering servant didn't stay crushed, but was vindicated for his suffering, was glorified for his sacrifice. He showed them how the suffering servant of Isaiah 53 and the conquering Messiah of Isaiah 9 could be the same person by rising from the dead. He showed them that God had not forsaken his son as the psalmist feared, because it also says, you will not abandon me to the realm of dead. You will not let your faithful one see decay. You will make known for me the path of life. You will fill me with joy in your presence, with eternal pleasures at your right hand. He reminded them that Job had been restored more glorious than before, that the throne of David was not empty, but had been filled by a crucified and risen king. Yes, the serpent had struck his heel, but he had crushed its head once and for all. Cleopas and Mary went through the entire spectrum of human emotions that afternoon. They laughed, they wept, they gasped in horror, they gasped in wonder, their palms were sweaty, their knees were weak, their lungs raced, their hearts burned in their chests. Minutes passed into hours, or had it been years, who could tell? Time and space ceased to exist. It was just he and them, as he told them the most compelling story they had ever heard. And it was their story. For him, this was not just history or religion. It was family. These were their ancestors. This was their story, and Jesus was at the very center of it. He had been all along. History, they discovered, is not a straight line. It's a circle, and now, no matter how far they ran, he was always at the center of their turning. From the beginning of time, he had been drawing them to himself with cords of love. It took a few moments for Cleopas and Mary to realize that they'd stopped walking. The stranger had finished his story and, seeming to know where they'd been headed, had stopped right in front of the home they were staying at that evening. Well, it's getting late, and I've got people waiting for me. See you soon. He began to leave as abruptly as he'd come. But as he turned to go, Mary put a hand on his shoulder. Please stay. Cleopas and his wife were no longer on different pages. Yes, please, we have plenty of food and room to spare. Won't you stay with us this evening? The stranger, with a smile, agreed, and soon they found themselves reclining together at the dinner table, where, out of courtesy, Cleopas asked the stranger to bless their meal. He took the bread in his hands, bowed his head, and began to pray. Abinu, he began, our Father. Cleopas and Mary opened their eyes and looked at each other. The whisper of a memory skittered across their minds. The stranger, unnoticing, continued, his prayer simple, powerful, and intimate. When he finished, he remained with his head bowed for just a moment, as if reluctant to leave this place of prayer. Then he looked at them. Mary gasped. Cleopas sat frozen in his chair as the stranger looked at them through eyes that both sparkled and burned, eyes as if he was on the verge of both laughing and weeping, yet at the same time he was completely serene. There was no madness in his eyes, but perfect clarity, as if he was completely aware of everything that was swirling around him, seeing every person, every possibility all at once. And yet, at the same time, they felt as if he were seeing only them, as if nothing else mattered to him. He held out the bread in front of him. It was only then that they noticed his hands, powerful, a craftsman's hands, rough and calloused from years of work. but with fresh wounds in the wrists that looked as if someone had recently driven a nail clean through. As tears began to stream down their faces, their breath coming in sobs, he smiled and broke the bread and was suddenly gone. And that, my friends, is the story of how Cleopas and Mary broke the record for the fastest 7-mile run from Emmaus to Jerusalem, a record that still stands to this day. And this is our story, friends. I tell this story today to make a simple point, that at the center of all of our stories is the resurrected Jesus. You may think of your life as a line. Maybe you think your line has been broken by all sorts of stuff that's happened to you. But it's not a line, it's a circle. It's a circle that spirals inward, and he has been drawing you to himself. At the center of every turning is him. And when you see him as he is, when you see him crucified and risen again, all of the broken pieces find a place. They find a wholeness and a completion. It's not that he broke you. It's not that he caused the damage or the pain. It's not that he likes this. But he's going to use all of it to draw you to himself and show you how much he loves you. And in him, risen, your life comes into focus. Like Cleopas and Mary, when we're wandering kind of in the dark, we're confused and lost. But when we see him, it all makes sense. Everything you've been looking for is found in him. Would you bow your heads with me? Jesus, we love you and we thank you that you love us, and you have been rewriting our story for years. God, I know on this day, this resurrection day, we have our minds in lots of different places, maybe on the chaos of getting here, maybe on what's going to happen next, whether it's brunch with family or Easter egg hunts with kids or whatever else, and all these are good things. But in this moment, Lord, it's you and us. It's always you and us. And I know you want to show your kids, your daughters and your sons, how much you love them. How through every moment of their lives you have been with them. And you have been drawing them to yourselves. You have been working through their story. I just get the feeling that some of my friends here feel like they've been trying to put together the broken pieces, the fragments, to make themselves whole. And I feel like you're telling them right now, all you need is me. You don't have to hold these pieces anymore. Just give them to me. Give all the pieces to me and let me do what I want with them. See, you're not putting them back together the way they were. You're making something new. You're at the center of all of our stories, drawing us to yourself with love to give us new life. Would we know it today?